Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and today I'm going to be covering a game from the 2010 World Blitz Championships that were held in November in Moscow, Russia. And this is a game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. And so I believe it's a 5-minute blitz game. And so Carlsen opens with e4, Nakamura answers with the French defense. So Hikaru's really capable of playing any opening, and especially in a blitz game, he's extremely dangerous. So knight c3, and so knight f6. So another option here for black was to play bishop to b4, but Hikaru decides on another main line with knight f6, which essentially forces e5. White doesn't want to play the exchange variation here. It's very simple, easily achieving equality for black in these types of positions. So now with e5 and knight to d7. So here the plan is going to be very simple. White is going to have this wedge, this dark squared wedge, the pawn wedge on e5, and black is going to have a slightly cramped position, but very solid, and he's going to try to chip away at white's center. So f4, so white wants to reinforce this pawn center, and so now c5. So knight f3 and knight c6. So the dynamics of the position are becoming easily apparent here. And so now a6. So another move in this position is queen to b6, trying to put some pressure on that b2 pawn, but there's a little trap here. After a3, queen takes, and knight to a4, and all of a sudden the black queen is lost. So a little poison pawn trap. So now going back, so queen b6 is another move there, but Hikaru plays a6, now queen d2, and again queen b6 here is also possible, although castling queenside or bishop e2 and sacrificing the pawn. Let's say bishop e2 takes, and now in this position white has ample compensation for the pawn that he's just sacrificed. So going back to the game, Hikaru plays a different line with b5, so instantly trying to gain space on the queen side and stir up a little bit of problem for white, maybe thinking about b4. So white answers with a3, so that at b4 he's going to open up his rook and start pinpointing that a6 pawn as a potential weakness. So instead of b4, Hikaru plays g5. And at the time, I thought it was a novelty, but this was actually seen in a blindfold game at Amber 2005, Anand versus Morozevich. So Morozevich had actually put this in a blindfold game, playing g5 here. So no doubt Nakamura was familiar with that game, and this idea is pretty popular in the French, specifically in these kind of lines. And if anyone wants to look a little further into it, I'd recommend checking out some games by Arthur Yusupov. He's played this g5 idea a number of times. So with g5, the idea is pretty simple. Black is trying to radically undermine this pawn center that white's established in the center. And let's say if knight takes g5, the tactics seem to favor black pretty well. Let's say takes. And now the idea, I'm assuming, would be bishop to c5. And so if queen d3, black's going to play knight takes e5, threatening that knight on g5 just to take a little bit further. Takes. Maybe white, I don't know. I mean, knight takes d5 doesn't even work here. Pawn takes, queen takes, trying to pinpoint these two, but queen to e3, and all of a sudden, the tactics just don't work for white. So that was one possible variation. Queen d2, and in this position, I mean, I think after queen b6, black would have more than sufficient compensation for the pawn in light of his domination of the dark squares, and it's going to be very tough for white to castle. So, going back to the game, a little complicated. That was the idea after knight takes g5. So in the game, f takes g5, and this seems to be more or less the principled line. So after f takes g5, so black has succeeded in, maybe he's got some squares with bishop g7, and he's going to have a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn. So now after taking d4 is logical, is just continuing to undermine the e5 pawn. So knight takes, and now knight c takes e5. So this is a very dynamic position, and it's extremely complicated. White has got some open files in the center to try to attack black's king, which looks like it might be in the center for a while. And in exchange, black has effectively demolished white's strong control of the center. And as far as material is concerned, material is equal, although white is definitely enjoying a good lead in development. So it's kind of like if black can make it out of this, he's going to have a much better pawn structure for the most part, especially with his center pawns, but it's not going to be so easy. So bishop d3, just continuing development logically, and so bishop b7, again developing. So castling, maybe eyeing that f7 square, and so now bishop g7, so also developing and trying to reinforce the center with these two bishops coming in. And so now knight to e2. And so in this position, I think black was supposed to play queen e7 to prevent any kind of tactics associated with g6. So in the game, he played knight g4, which also makes sense. He wants to maybe get that dark squared bishop, and maybe thinking about deploying the queen to b6. Although the computer is telling me here g6 maybe it just wins here. I mean, this is a very computer move, and this is also a blitz game, so g6 is pretty tough to see. But the idea is to try to weaken that e6 square. So after takes, I think knight takes e6, maybe bishop e5, and then rook takes f7 here to avoid perpetual check. Whereas if knight takes, black's going to get a perpetual check out of this. So that's a pretty complicated line. But knight takes e6, so pawn takes, bishop check, king e7, and I think white's going to be getting the better of this, as black's king is kind of in no man's land there. Not to mention, white's just going to get the piece back, the bishop on g7. So very complicated game. This sacrifice looks like it works out very well for white due to the instability of black's king. So that was 15 g6. And that apparently was white's best try, but in a blitz game, that's pretty unclear. So he just plays king to h1, just trying to get his king maybe out of, off this diagonal here, and safeguarding the king is always a good idea in a complicated position. So black has achieved his aim of, increasing the control of his dark square bishop by trading his opponent's dark square bishop, and now queen d7. So just preparing to castle queenside, and also defending the f7 pawn. So knight to g3, so white is lining up some nasty ideas with knight to f5, and so bishop to e5. Bishop to e5, I mean, it's a good move to centralize the bishop, and maybe he's, thinking about some ideas, on attacking the h2 pawn of white's king. So c3, so white is shoring up his position, and now rook to g8. So rook to g8 was a pretty ambitious move. I wasn't too sure about this one. I think maybe it was better for black to just go ahead and castle. But the problem is, if he castles too early before white centralizes this rook, a4 is really going to start busting up his king side. And that's not going to be too fun for black. So I think that's the idea with rook g8. He wants to try to delay castling as long as possible so that white could maybe centralize the rook, and then black could castle queenside. So h4, just trying to hold on to the pawn there. And so now h6, so taking advantage of that pressure he's got along the g-file with the knight on g3. And so now knight to f5, and Carlsen decides to try to drop a bomb by sacrificing a piece here to exploit black's king being in the center and the relative discoordination of his pieces. So with pawn takes and knight takes, and now queen c5, so it's definitely logical if you're being attacked, you want to trade off some pieces. And after takes, so now black is threatening the bishop on d3, although it's not so easy. So knight takes h6, so he's counterattacking the rook on g8. So now rook to h8. So this was a good move. Much better than playing rook to g7, because the rook on h8 is going to be threatening this knight on h6, and it's also going to be threatening this pawn on h4. So definitely good. So now bishop to c2, and so now f6. So another nice move by Hikaru, because if pawn takes, he's going to be able to take this knight on h6, and it looks like maybe he can try to hold on. I mean, it's going to be pretty tough. Let's say rook here, check, and knight to e4 would really save the day for black, guarding that bishop on e5. So going back, after f6, now rook to e1. So he's got to put some pressure on that bishop. And so now white's got some serious threats of playing rook takes f6, for example. So rook takes h6 by black was a very good move because now his pieces are excellently coordinated in the center. He's got 2 pieces for the exchange, so 2 pieces for a rook here. And these pawns by white are extremely weak, not to mention white's king is not so safe either. So king to e7, trying to mobilize black's last piece that's not developed. And the centralized pieces by black, again, are very tough to combat for white. So rook h8. Now rook h5. So in this position, black could have won an exchange here to convert to an endgame where he'd be up a piece, but it's definitely not a clean win. Something like this, and this is going to be tough. This is going to be a tough win for sure. Even though black is up a piece here, something like rook here, and black is up a piece, but it's going to be tough. White's got all these pawns, and there's not a lot of material. Also, black's bishop is very bad. So going back to the game, that was knight g3, trapping the rook on h5. King to f7, so he's getting his king, kind of out of the way of any nasty checks on the e-file, and now g4. So here, bishop to f4, he's rounding up the pawn on h6, and so bishop to b3. So Carlsen's creating some nasty threats, specifically taking the knight on e4. So knight to d2, hitting the bishop and threatening knight to f3 check, so bishop d1 to prevent that check. And now Hikaru tries to cash in, and in this position, I believe Nakamura went on to win a complicated time scramble. So I think he flagged Magnus, and the moves weren't written down because it was too fast. But black is clearly winning in this position. He's got a bishop and knight for a rook and a pawn, and just a simple move. I mean, he's knight to e4 is going to be easy, centralizing the knight, and there was also bishop to c8, trying to put some pressure on those pawns. So either way, bishop c2 blundered, knight f3 checks. So easy stuff by Hikaru. So a very fine game by Hikaru Nakamura. And, what else can you say? I mean, he played great in the opening. And Carlsen missed maybe a couple of chances. But overall, extremely complicated. And that kind of tactics definitely appeals to Nakamura's style. So this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net. And thanks for tuning in.